Hello and welcome to the debate. I'm Marzi Hashimi. Thanks so much for being with us. Well, which countries would not want to see a world without nukes? Well, apparently the United States, Canada, and the UK just said no to no nukes. A non-proliferation nuclear conference was held for 1 month by the United Nations and attended by more than 150 countries, but it took these three to make all the efforts null and void, and the U.S. vetoed the plan because of fear that Israel would have to give up its nukes. What does it all mean? Well, stay with us as we take a look at this subject on this debate.
In recent months, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu caused the relations between Israel and the U.S. to plunge to their lowest level in decades. That's mainly because of his firm opposition to any nuclear deal between the P5+1 and Iran. Netanyahu has even been lobbying Republican lawmakers behind Obama's back and is doing his best to sabotage the ongoing talks between Iran and the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council plus Germany. Meanwhile, Israel's rejection of a US-backed two-state solution to the conflict with Palestine in March further raised tensions with Washington. American diplomats have warned Tel Aviv that Washington could halt its support for Israel at the UN if it presses ahead with its policies. But that stance failed a major test on the final day of a conference in New York, which was held to review the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. The conference ended in failure after the US blocked the proposed ban on nukes in the Middle East as a favor to nuclear-armed Israel. More than 150 countries took part in the month-long event, which needed a consensus to adopt a decision.
The United States has never acted in any respect for a nuclear-free area in the Middle East. They have facilitated, they have supported, they have expanded the Israeli nuclear arsenal from its beginning until this very moment.
Tel Aviv was quick to appreciate the move. The Israeli premier conveyed his gratitude to Obama in a phone conversation with Secretary of State John Kerry. Tel Aviv also thanked Britain and Canada for joining America in preventing a resolution at the New York conference. Meanwhile, an Israeli official has said that Washington kept its commitment to Tel Aviv by resisting the ban. Israel is the sole possessor of nuclear weapons in the Middle East and is widely believed to have hundreds of warheads in its arsenal. Its nukes have been described as the key destabilizing source in the Middle East, but the US is unwilling to listen to criticism of Israel. At the same time, Washington keeps pressuring Iran, which is a member of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty and has cooperated with the International Atomic Energy Agency. Observers believe that's because Iran isn't in the circle of US allies in the region and opposes its policies. The US double standards over the past decades have emboldened Israel to the extent that at times it even defies its own staunch allies.
I'd like to welcome my guest to the program. Out of London, journalist and political analyst Hafsa Kara Mustafa, and out of New York, journalist and political commentator Ms. Maxine Dover. Thank you both for being with us tonight. Well, let's start this off in New York with Ms. Dover. Now, in your perspective, why would the U.S. vote against a nuclear-free world?
I don't think the U.S. is voting against a nuclear-free world. The U.S. voted against a conference to be scheduled in some 10 months without any agenda being placed on the table. That was what the vote was against.
Okay, what about it, Ms. Mustafa? Your take on this, because actually what they voted for was basically not to go for trying to get a nuclear-free Middle East. Your take, ma'am, why would Washington do this?
Well, Washington is obviously signaling that its main priority in the Middle East is to safeguard Israel. I think it has to be noted that the wording, the final wording coming out of Washington is incredibly alarming, because what it did was literally give the green light for Israel to actually eventually have the possibility to use nuclear weapons against its Arab neighbors. Now, what it said was they're opposing, in effect, this ban because they recognize that Israel is in somewhat of a hostile neighborhood, and therefore therefore Israel should be allowed to use its nuclear weapons. This is incredibly alarming, and I think the international community, when I say the international community, I mean outside of UK, US and Canada, but rather the wider world should be incredibly alarmed at this latest development, which basically has ensured that Israel, which we know is a nuclear weapon, nuclear power, despite denying it, obviously, it is actually given the green light by very powerful nations to actually use these very lethal weapons against its neighbors. And I think this is a very, very alarming development, as I said.
What about that, Ms. Dover? Do you agree with our guests in London that this creates a dangerous precedent?
No, of course I disagree with that.
Go ahead.
The fact is that Israel has had rumors of nuclear capability for many decades and has never used it. The rumors themselves are enough of a detriment. Even in its deepest dangers in 1973, for example, there was no use of nuclear, there was no threat of nuclear weapons to be used. And on the contrary, it is a deterrent. There are those who say that were the Arabs to put down their arms, and there would be peace. Were Israel to put down its arms, it would be in pieces.
So you're saying having a nuclear weapon, you're saying, Ms. Dover, having a nuclear weapon, Israel having a nuclear weapon is a deterrent? Is that what you're saying?
I am saying that indeed, and it is a fact of political experience that a deterrent can sometimes prevent acts that would cause that deterrent to be used.
So who determines then, Ms. Dover? Who determines who can get? Who determines, Ms. Dover, who can get that deterrent? You're saying that it is a deterrent for Israel. Well, who determines who needs that deterrent? Who is to say that Israel needs it and other countries or entities do not need it? Who makes that call?
Well, I think my colleague in London has named the problem. It is a hostile neighborhood. And Israel is a very small country in a very wide area of hostile neighbors. Neighbors that some of those neighbors say that the only way for Israel to continue is to not continue. And I refer specifically to the threats from Iran, which has threatened to wipe Israel off the map.
Okay, well, interesting you brought up Iran. Let me turn to Ms. Mustafa. Interesting that she's brought up Iran, because we know with Iran has actually continually said that it is not actual, it's never been actually after nuclear weapons, however, nuclear energy and nuclear technology. And we see the type of pressure that the so-called international community continually puts on Tehran, but at the same time, the United States actually does not allow a measure to go forward to try to have a non-nuclear Middle East. Can you explain that for me? Your take, ma'am.
Well, I think it's a very important point you raised. So on the one hand, you have Iran, which hasn't attacked a single country in way over 150 years. It isn't in violation of any international resolutions, and it is claiming and it is trying to develop peaceful nuclear technology. And yet it's being put under pressure, it's being sanctioned, whereas you contrast that with Israel, which has violated over 67 UN resolutions. It has deleted Palestine from the map. It illegally invaded Lebanon for 22 years. It continues to occupy Syria, the Golan Heights. It invaded Sinai, and yet still, despite that, the US regards Israel as being a fair owner of nuclear weaponry, whereas Iran, which, as I said, hasn't violated any UN resolutions, hasn't started a single war in over 150 years, is being put under tremendous pressure. So we're seeing that the US is actually supporting a warmongering nation that has violated international law and that doesn't respect any of its neighbors. As I said, it has deleted Palestine from the map and has illegally occupied numerous of its neighbors, and yet, on the other hand, puts pressure on Iran, which hasn't done done any of those things. So what we're actually witnessing is a very powerful nation actually supporting a warmongering nation and really trying very hard to destabilize even more the Middle East.
Okay,
so
stay with me,
you're
Ms.
punishing a country that is in violation of international law.
Stay with me, both of our guests. Stay with me, Ms. Dover. We're going to cross over to our Facebook wall and see what some of our viewers have commented on this subject.
US has been absolutely loyal to the cancerous Zionist regime since its illegal occupation of Palestinian land. It has vetoed all resolutions against Israel, while an independent nation like Iran is put under sanctions because it resists the Western hegemony with a Zionist agenda. The nuclear weapons in Israel are really America's weapons. The Zionist state is just a base. Clear as water, Israel, a poor baby, needs to defend itself. The axis of evil consists of US, Israel and its allies. Iran needs to be nuclear, otherwise it will end up like Iraq, Syria, Afghanistan, and the list goes on. American policy in the region has always been the problem. If Israel can have nuclear weapons, why can't others?
Well, crossing back to New York, Ms. Dover, you were saying something prior to us going to our Facebook wall. Go ahead.
Yes, let me respond to the idea that Iran has not conducted war in decades. That is not true in fact. It may be true in concept, but not in fact.
Explain that,
Iran
please.
is using proxies. It's using Hezbollah. Iran is arming Hezbollah. Iran is arming the Syrian army as it is destroying its own people. It has killed 250,000 or thereabouts of its own people. The government in Syria has used weapons of mass destruction, not as a deterrent, but in fact used those weapons against its own people. That's the sort of actions that Israel must be ready to deter.
Well, let's look at that. Let's look at that, Ms. Dover. Let's look at what you've just said. Let's look at what you've just said, because you talked about Iran and, as you call it, proxy wars. When we look at Iran itself, when we look at in the 8-year war that was imposed on the Islamic Republic of Iran, and we know that the chemical weapons was used against Iran, and that Iran had access to similar type of weapons, but refused to use it because it was deemed anti-humanity, anti-Islamic. So this is the precedent that Iran has set. On the other hand, if we look at even the last decade, as far as the precedent that Israel has set and the number of people that have been killed by Israel, how can you say that actually Israel is no threat to its neighbors? I'm going to toss that over to London now. Your take, actually, Ms. Mustafa, on the threat of the region in the Middle East and how that makes the neighbors feel actually having a nuclear Israel.
Well, just to reiterate about the Iran support of Hezbollah, which is no secret, we have to remember what led Iran to actually support Hezbollah. It was because the south of Lebanon was illegally occupied by Israel, and therefore the population of South Lebanon had to become organized and resist, as it is allowed to in international law, resist the illegal occupation of South Lebanon. And what Iran did was actually help a country that was illegally occupied in resisting occupation, a bit like the Allied forces were supporting France when it was illegally resisting Nazi occupation. So I think the role of Iran has been a force for good, really, overall in the Middle East, and the only force for bad, as a viewer actually mentioned, the axis of evil really comes down to Israel, which, as we have reiterated, has illegally invaded South Lebanon, continues to illegally invade the Golan Heights, illegally invaded the Sinai, and actually deleted Palestine from the map. Now, as for chemical weapons, we've seen the footage, and the UN reports have actually condemned Israel for its use of white phosphorus in heavily, densely populated civilian areas. So again, the culprit, the guilty party, the violator of human rights in the region is Israel. No other country has actually violated so many international resolutions and continues to do so with such impunity other than Israel. And I think the worst thing that we could see is to continue to have a nuclear power Israel. Now, in order to counter that, I really do, and I'm not Iranian, obviously, so that's a very difficult decision to make, but I would hope to see Iran become a nuclear power, because I think we need that balance in the Middle East in order to turn down the hegemony and the violent streak of a state that has violated so many international resolutions.
Well, Ms. Dover, you're sitting in the United States, you're sitting in New York. I want to look at from that perspective, from the American's perspective, as far as how does Washington benefits from this. We look at the situation, one second, please. We look at the situation and the hundreds of billions of dollars that's required actually to take care of these nuclear warheads and to make sure that they're safe, constantly spending money on it when the infrastructure of the United States is in dire need of improvement. As an American, would you not prefer to see your country improve and money being spent on positive programs than nuclear weapons that the United States continually say on the one hand that they are against nuclear weapons, but of course have it themselves and obviously support other entities to have it?
Let me respond, first of all, to my colleague in London. Can you name any other country that is threatened to be wiped off the map, to be eliminated as a country, as an entire entity? There is no country other than Israel that faces that threat. And the threat is, let me respond, and the threat is coming from not only one neighbor, but from several of its neighbors. Not a very neighborly act or direction. With regard to the question raised about U.S. spending, the United States, thank God, has enough resources and funds to correct what needs to be corrected, and is in the process of doing so. Should there be a more rapid response to the needs of infrastructure? Absolutely. And the train wreck in Philadelphia about 2 weeks ago certainly shows that we need to use modern technology. If we're going to use modern speed and we're going to use modern transportation, we need to employ the modern technology, a large part of which, by the way, originates in Israeli research. And that is research that is being used not only in Israel, not only in America, but throughout the world. When you pick up your cell phone, you're picking up Israeli technology. And that technology and that knowledge could be made to do good throughout the Middle East, throughout the world. If the monies that are being spent on all sides in defensive, offensive weapons would be eliminated and would be changed, there is no reason why the world would not benefit.
Okay, well, interesting point you made. Interesting point you made about weapons being eliminated. But actually, this program is talking about the lack of actually going in that direction to try to eliminate it. Ms. Kara Mustafa, talking about a point that Ms. Dover has just pointed out and talked about the dangerous neighborhood that Israel lives in. I want to look at that aspect of it, because if we look at the Middle East today and we look at that, one of the biggest threats besides Israel itself, of course, is ISIL, and we see this coordination. We have seen in Syria this coordination between the terrorists and Israel actually, some from the al-Nusra Front and others, and actually helping them, nursing them back to health. So we see an interesting alliance that many experts have said that actually this is an Israeli project along with Saudis to actually cause this type of chaos in the region. I want to look at that aspect of who is really being threatened now in the region. Is it Israel? Because we see that Saudi Arabia definitely didn't do anything against Israel, and none of the other Arab countries have done really anything against Israel. But the one country that was trying to deal with the resistance, which was, of course, Syria, we see it basically in disarray now.
Just one very brief point about the idea that Israel was threatened of being wiped off the map. There are two elements to that point. Mahmoud Ahmadinejad famously said that and was misquoted. What he was saying was that Israel, being a colonial state, will face the same fate as all other colonial states in the past. Where is French Algeria today? Where is French Indochina? Where is the British Raj of India today? Israel is a colonial state and is therefore faced with an expiry date like all other colonial states in past history. So just to bring back the point about its very unhealthy alliance.
State. It is not a colonial state.
Russians and Poles and Ukrainians do not come from Middle East. Do not come from the Middle East. Poles and Russians do not come from the Middle East. Hasidic Jews with their big furry hats are clearly not indigenous to a land where there is 35 degrees centigrade all year round. And I didn't interrupt you. I did not interrupt you. So do not interrupt me, Ms. Dover. Israelis are from Russia, are from Poland, are from Ukraine. So don't change history. Theodor Herzl, the founder of Israel, is a Hungarian. He's not from the Middle East. He never set foot in the Middle East. So please leave that moronic history to the Fox News viewers. Viewers of Press TV know the basics of history of the Middle East, and they know that Russians, that Poles, that Ukrainians who founded the Zionist ideology are not indigenous to the Middle East.
And I'm so sorry, both of you. I am very sorry. Very interesting discussion, but we unfortunately are out of time. I'd like to thank both my guests out of New York, Ms. Maxine Dover, journalist and political commentator, and out of London, journalist and political analyst, Ms. Hafsa Kara Mustafa. And thank you, viewers, as always, for being with us on another debate. I'm Marzia Hashemi, signing out for myself and all the crew right here in Tehran. Thanks so much, and goodbye.